It was a sunny afternoon when Karen, a woman with a lot of confidence in her own opinions, decided to visit one of the most famous royal palaces in the city. She had heard about the history and the beauty of the palace, and today she was finally going to see it for herself. Karen was excited, but she was also in a hurry. She didn't like waiting, and she always expected things to go the way she wanted. As Karen walked up to the grand entrance of the palace, she noticed something interesting. There were two tall, serious-looking guards standing still beside the door. They wore shining armor and held long, beautiful sabers at their sides. Their faces were stern, showing no emotion. Karen, who thought of herself as a very important person, immediately took notice of them. She loved to be the center of attention and was used to people looking at her. So, as she stood there for a moment, she felt a sense of superiority. The guards didn't move a muscle. They were statues, only watching the people around them. They were part of the palace's royal ceremony and were supposed to be an important symbol of the kingdom's strength and history. But to Karen, they just seemed like part of the background. A decoration, really. As she stepped closer to them, she wondered aloud why they were standing there for so long. She couldn't help but voice her thoughts. Why are they just standing there like that? It's a bit much, don't you think? She said to her friend, who had joined her for the visit. Her friend, a little quieter and more respectful, shrugged and said, "I think they are part of the ceremony. It's tradition." Karen wasn't one to care much about tradition. She was the kind of person who believed that rules didn't always apply to her. She expected everything to move faster, and she thought that if she asked for something, people should give it to her right away. "I don't see why I should wait around for these people to finish their little ceremony," Karen muttered, more to herself than anyone else. She wasn't impressed by the guards at all. She thought it was all just a show. As she continued walking, Karen found herself in front of one of the guards. She looked up at the shiny saber in his hand. It was beautifully crafted, with a long, polished blade and gold decorations along the hilt. The guard stood as still as a statue, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But Karen, with her usual boldness, thought it would be a good idea to ask the guard if she could hold the saber for a picture. That would make a great photo, she thought, imagining herself posing with the weapon like a queen. She turned to the guard and smiled. "Hey, I'd love to hold that saber for a quick photo. Could you hand it to me?" she asked, her voice friendly but with an edge of expectation. She was sure that the guard would smile and hand it over without any trouble. After all, she was a guest, and in her mind, that should mean she could do whatever she wanted. But the guard didn't respond. He didn't smile. He didn't even look at her. His face remained calm and serious, as if he hadn't even heard her request. Karen stood there for a moment, waiting for him to react, but he just remained perfectly still. To Karen, it felt as if she was invisible. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not in such an obvious way. She began to feel the first signs of frustration. Karen stood there for a few more seconds, her face starting to show the first signs of irritation. She couldn't believe the guard wasn't reacting to her request. To her, it felt like a simple thing, just a picture with the saber. She was used to getting what she wanted, and she didn't understand why this guard wasn't cooperating. She looked over at her friend, who was quietly standing off to the side, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "Can you believe this?" Karen whispered to her friend. "I asked so nicely, and he doesn't even look at me. What's the big deal with holding the sword for a minute?" Her friend didn't know how to respond. She had seen the guards stand there for hours without saying a word to anyone. She was trying to enjoy the experience, but Karen's attitude was starting to make her uncomfortable. Still, she didn't want to get involved in the situation, so she just nodded awkwardly and said, "Maybe we should just leave them alone, Karen." But Karen was determined. She wasn't going to let some stiff ceremony ruin her day. She believed she was entitled to more. After all, she was a paying guest at the palace. Surely that meant she should be able to have a little fun with the royal guards and take a photo with their weapons. And so, Karen took a deep breath and decided to try again. This time, she approached the guard with more confidence. She smiled at him, her tone sweeter now, almost as if trying to charm him into giving her what she wanted. "Excuse me," she said, a little louder than before. "I just want a quick picture with the saber. It would look amazing on social media, you know. I bet the royal family would be proud to see how well I'm handling their weapons." The guard's eyes stayed focused straight ahead, showing no sign that he had heard her. His body remained completely still, almost as if he were a statue. Karen paused, waiting for him to react, but there was nothing. No smile, no acknowledgement, just complete silence. Feeling more frustrated now, Karen leaned closer to the guard. "You're making this so difficult. I just want a picture. What's the harm in that? I'm not going to hurt anyone," she said, trying to make it sound reasonable. She glanced at her friend again, hoping to find some support, but her friend wasn't making eye contact. She was clearly embarrassed by the whole scene. Karen wasn't going to back down, though. She had already decided she wasn't going to leave without that picture. Still, the guard didn't move. His face remained as emotionless as ever, his posture unchanging. For a moment, Karen wasn't sure what to do next. She had tried being polite, and that had gotten her nowhere. She wasn't used to being ignored, especially not by someone who was just standing there in a uniform. She decided that if a polite request wouldn't work, she would try a different approach. With a deep breath, Karen took a step closer to the guard. She raised her hand toward the saber, slowly reaching for the hilt. She thought to herself, maybe if I just take it, he'll have to react. Maybe then he'll see how serious I am about this. She couldn't believe how easy it would be to grab the sword, pose for her picture, and make everyone see how important she was. But little did she know, the guard had been watching her every move, and he wasn't about to let her take the saber. Karen's hand was now hovering just inches away from the guard's saber. She could feel the cool air around her fingertips as she stretched her hand toward the shining blade. She thought to herself, this will be so easy. I'll grab it, and then I'll take a perfect picture. Everyone will be so impressed. Her mind raced with the image of her holding the sword, smiling for the camera, and sharing it on social media. But just as her fingers touched the hilt of the saber, something happened. In one smooth motion, the guard stepped forward, his body blocking her hand. He didn't raise his voice, but the action was clear. He wasn't going to let her take the weapon. Karen froze for a moment. Her fingers were still close to the sword, but now the guard's body was standing between her and it. He turned his head slightly to look at her, his face as calm as ever, though his eyes showed a quiet firmness. He didn't need to say anything. His actions spoke louder than words. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but serious. "You are not allowed to handle the weapon. Please step back." Karen pulled her hand away quickly, startled by the guard's sudden movement. She hadn't expected him to react so quickly. For a brief second, she felt embarrassed, but the feeling quickly turned into irritation. How dare he stop me? I just wanted a quick picture. Why was he making this so difficult? She was used to people being more accommodating to her requests, and now she was growing more frustrated by the second. "That's ridiculous," Karen blurted out, her voice louder than before. "I'm just asking to hold it for a minute. You're making a big deal out of nothing." The guard stood still, his expression unchanged. His posture was perfect, as if he were rooted to the ground. His gaze never left hers, but there was no anger in his eyes, just a quiet professionalism. He didn't seem at all bothered by Karen's frustration. Instead, he simply repeated his words, now in an even more firm tone. "Please step back, ma'am. This is not for public use." Karen's face flushed with anger. She couldn't believe it. Here she was, a guest in the palace, and this guard was treating her like she was causing trouble. All she wanted was to take a picture, and yet he was refusing her request. "Why are you being so rude?" she demanded, raising her voice again. "I'm just trying to have a little fun. You don't have to be so serious about it." Her words hung in the air, but the guard didn't flinch. He didn't get upset or defensive. He simply kept his eyes on her and stayed in his position. It was clear that he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Karen wasn't used to being ignored, especially not when she felt she had every right to ask for something. She thought of herself as someone who should be treated with respect and kindness, and in this moment, she wasn't feeling that at all. The longer the silence stretched on, the more impatient she became. "I just don't understand why you're making this so difficult," Karen said, crossing her arms in frustration. She glanced around at the crowd that had begun to gather, noticing a few people watching the scene with curiosity. The guard remained unfazed, still standing tall, unmoving and serious. Karen realized that her approach wasn't working. She had already tried being polite, then demanding, and now she was growing desperate. But no matter what she said, the guard was unmoved. He was not going to let her take the saber. Karen stood there, her arms crossed tightly across her chest, her eyes narrowing in frustration. She couldn't believe the nerve of the guard. She had asked so nicely, and yet he was refusing her simple request. Her patience was quickly running out, and she felt her face growing hot with anger. "Why is he acting like this?" she thought. "It's just a picture." Her gaze shifted around the area. More people had gathered, curious about what was happening. Some of them were whispering to each other, and Karen could feel their eyes on her. She didn't like being the center of attention like this, especially when it was because of a disagreement with a guard. The more she stood there, the more embarrassed she felt. But she wasn't going to back down. Not now. The guard remained completely still, showing no sign of agitation. His expression was unreadable, his posture perfect. He wasn't like the people she was used to dealing with, those who would quickly give in to her demands. This guard was different. He didn't care that she was annoyed or upset. He was just doing his job. Karen found herself feeling more and more irritated by his calmness. After a long silence, Karen finally spoke again, her voice filled with disbelief. "Do you even know who I am?" she asked, her tone sharp and demanding. "I'm just asking for a simple favor, and you're treating me like I'm some kind of troublemaker." The guard's face didn't change. He didn't look angry or upset by her words. He just looked at her calmly, as if he had heard this type of conversation many times before. "Ma'am," he said, his voice still firm and polite, "I'm here to protect the palace and uphold its traditions. The weapons I carry are part of that tradition. I cannot give them to you." Karen's frustration only grew. She had never been the kind of person to be ignored, and she wasn't about to let this guard stop her now. She tried to argue back, her voice louder this time. "This is ridiculous. I don't even want to take it for long. I just want a picture. You're making it so complicated for no reason." But the guard's response was simple, calm, and unwavering. "I'm afraid that's not something I can allow, ma'am." The more Karen tried to argue, the more the guard stood his ground. It was as though his silence was the strongest response he could give. He wasn't going to let her take the saber. He wasn't going to argue or explain himself further. He was simply doing his duty. Karen looked around at the people who had gathered. Some of them were watching with curiosity. Others were clearly embarrassed by her behavior. She could hear a few quiet whispers, and she started to feel like the focus of everyone's attention was shifting from the royal palace to her. She realized then that her behavior was starting to make people uncomfortable. It wasn't just the guard who was unmoving. The crowd was starting to take notice of her outburst. They didn't seem to approve of how she was treating the guard, and that realization made Karen feel even more uncomfortable. She didn't like being judged, especially by strangers. Karen took a step back, still frustrated but now more aware of how she was coming across. She had tried everything, being polite, being demanding, even arguing. But none of it worked. The guard stood there, unwavering, his professionalism a reminder that no matter how much she complained, he wasn't going to change his stance. The silence stretched on again, and for the first time, Karen began to question whether it was really worth continuing to argue. The guard's calm presence made her feel small, as if her demands meant nothing in the face of his duty. He was not going to give in, and it seemed like she had no choice but to accept it. Karen stood there, her heart pounding with frustration. She had tried everything, asking nicely, demanding politely, and even raising her voice, but nothing was working. The guard still stood there, as unmoving and unyielding as a statue. He wasn't going to hand over the saber, no matter what she said or did. Karen was getting angrier by the second. She crossed her arms tightly across her chest, glaring at the guard. How dare he treat me like this? She thought. I'm just trying to get a picture. Why is he making it so hard? She had never felt so disrespected in her life. To her, this was just a simple favor she was asking for, but the guard was acting as if it was the end of the world. Karen looked around the crowd again. A few people had stopped to watch, their eyes on her as she argued with the guard. Some of them were whispering to each other, while others just stared quietly. It was clear that Karen was drawing attention. She didn't like the feeling at all, but it only made her more determined. She wasn't going to let this guard win. You know, Karen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, I don't understand why this is such a big deal. You stand there all day just waiting for someone to come along. I just want to hold the saber for a picture, and you're acting like I'm asking for the world. It's ridiculous. The guard's expression didn't change. He was still standing tall and looking straight ahead, his gaze never wavering. He didn't react to her words. It was as if Karen wasn't even speaking. She was used to people responding to her, to people bending to her will, but not this time. This guard was different. He wasn't going to engage with her. Her frustration reached a breaking point. I'm not going to let him win, she thought fiercely. She had been patient enough. Now she would get the picture she wanted, no matter what it took. She wasn't going to walk away feeling like she had lost. With a defiant step, Karen moved closer to the guard. She reached her hand out again, her fingers brushing the hilt of the saber. This time, there was no hesitation. She was going to grab it. She thought if she just took it, there would be no way the guard could stop her. He was too focused on standing still, and she could easily pull the weapon out for a quick photo. But before she could get a firm grip on the sword, the guard's quick reflexes stopped her once again. In a flash, his hand shot out, blocking hers before she could touch the saber. It happened so fast that Karen barely had time to react. She pulled her hand back in surprise, staring at the guard in disbelief. Ma'am, the guard said, his voice even more firm than before. I've asked you nicely to step back. You must respect the palace's rules. Karen's face turned red with anger. She couldn't believe it. She had tried to be polite. She had asked for a simple favor, and yet this guard was refusing to listen. It was as if he was determined to make her look foolish in front of everyone. I don't understand why you're treating me like this. Karen snapped, her voice rising. I'm a guest here. I should be treated with respect, not like I'm some criminal. The guard didn't respond. His eyes remained calm and focused, his stance unshaken. He wasn't going to argue with her. He was simply going to do his job and protect the palace. No matter how much Karen insisted, the answer was going to remain the same. The saber wasn't for her to hold. The tension between them grew, and Karen felt the weight of the crowd's eyes on her once again. But this time, it didn't matter. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let the guard's calmness defeat her. She was sure that if she just kept pushing, he would eventually give in. Karen stood still, her heart racing. She had never been this frustrated in her life. Every word she spoke, every move she made, was met with the same calm, unyielding reaction from the guard. No matter how hard she tried, he wouldn't give in. She glanced around again at the growing crowd of onlookers. People were still watching, and she could feel their eyes on her. Some seemed to be shaking their heads. Others whispered quietly to one another. Karen didn't like being the center of attention in this way. She was used to people admiring her confidence, not staring at her like she was causing a scene. But she didn't care. She was convinced that if she just kept pushing, she would get her way. She crossed her arms, looking the guard up and down, and huffed loudly. This is ridiculous, she thought. He can't just stand there forever. I'm a guest here. I deserve this. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe if I give him one more chance to be reasonable, he'll understand, she thought. Karen took a deep breath and forced a smile, trying to soften her approach. Okay, look, I get it. You have your rules and everything. But I'm really just asking for one photo. It'll only take a second, and then I'll leave you alone. Don't you think that's fair? But the guard didn't even look at her. His face remained completely neutral. He didn't respond, didn't move, and didn't give any sign of acknowledging her attempt to make peace. His eyes were still locked straight ahead, focused on his duty. Karen felt her frustration bubble up again, and her patience snapped. I'm not asking for much, she exclaimed, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear. I'm a paying guest at this palace. I have every right to ask for a little respect and a quick picture. Why are you being so difficult? The guard didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stood there, unmoving. It was as if her words didn't even matter to him. His composure, his professionalism, it was clear that he was not going to allow her to break his focus. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, the guard spoke again. His voice was calm, but his words were firm. Ma'am, I've asked you politely to step back. I have given you more than enough chances to respect the rules. I'm here to protect this palace, and I must uphold its traditions. You will not touch the weapon. Please leave the area. The finality in his tone made Karen pause. For the first time in this entire exchange, she felt a sense of being out of control. The guard's words weren't just polite. They were commanding. There was no room for argument anymore. His duty was clear, and he wasn't going to budge. Karen opened her mouth to say something more, but for some reason, no words came out. She wanted to argue, to find another way to win. But something about the guard's calmness stopped her. She had been defying him for so long, and now she realized she had pushed too far. The crowd around her seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere. It was as if the tension had shifted. People were no longer watching with curiosity. They were watching with quiet judgment. Karen felt a pang of embarrassment. Why was I pushing so hard? She wondered. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her now, and it wasn't the kind of attention she wanted. She took a step back, still fuming, but now realizing that her behavior wasn't going to get her what she wanted. The guard stood his ground, his professionalism clear, and Karen knew she had no choice but to back off. Karen stood there, her mind racing. She had finally stepped back, but the feeling of frustration still simmered inside her. She couldn't believe she was being treated like this. She was a guest, and yet this guard was acting like she was a criminal. All she wanted was a picture, and now it felt like everything had turned against her. The guard remained still, his eyes focused straight ahead. He didn't look at her with anger or frustration, but there was a quiet firmness in his stance. Karen's gaze shifted to the crowd that had gathered. A few people were watching closely, some with raised eyebrows, others shaking their heads. She could feel their silent judgment. She didn't like how it felt. She had always been the one in control of situations, but now she was the one being scrutinized. She had no idea how to handle it. Karen wasn't used to being embarrassed like this. It felt strange to her, almost like she had lost her place in the world. But even as she stood there, Karen couldn't help but feel that there was still a part of her that refused to back down completely. She wanted to argue again, to try to make the guard see her side, but a small voice inside her told her it wasn't going to work. She had already tried everything she could think of, and it hadn't changed anything. The guard spoke again, his voice calm and even, but it carried an authority that made Karen pause. I've asked you more than once, Ma'am, he said, his eyes still focused ahead, never leaving his post. Please respect the rules. You will not handle the weapon, and I must ask that you leave the area now. Karen opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. She had nothing left to say. The reality of the situation was settling in. No matter how much she protested, the guard wasn't going to change his stance. She couldn't keep pushing him. his duty, his professionalism. It was clear that he wasn't going to bend for her. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Karen took a deep breath, her chest tightening as she realized the crowd was still watching her. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, and it was starting to make her feel small. She had never felt this way before, and it wasn't something she liked. Her pride had been hurt, and it stung. The guard didn't move. He didn't respond to her silence or her hesitation. He just stood there, as if waiting for her to make the decision. It was up to her now. The situation had been drawn to a close, and Karen had to either accept it or keep going. She knew, deep down, that continuing to argue would only make things worse. She glanced at her friend, who was standing nearby, watching the scene unfold. Her friend looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. Karen could feel her own discomfort growing. She didn't like the way this had turned out. She didn't like how she had been made to look. Karen's hands dropped to her sides, and she took a step back. She didn't say anything, but her body language spoke louder than words. The guard had made his point clear, and now she was left to face the consequences of her actions. There was no use in arguing anymore. The situation was over. With one last look at the guard, Karen finally turned away. She didn't walk off with her usual confidence. Instead, she walked away quietly, her head down, feeling a mix of frustration and embarrassment. The crowd had already started to disperse, and Karen was left alone with her thoughts. As Karen walked away, her mind was buzzing with thoughts. She had never been treated like that before. For a moment, she couldn't quite process what had just happened. It felt like she had lost a battle she hadn't expected to fight. All she wanted was a quick picture with the Saber, but somehow it had turned into something much bigger. She walked down the path away from the royal guard, her eyes on the ground. She couldn't help but feel embarrassed. She had been so sure of herself, so confident that she could get what she wanted. But now she realized how wrong she had been. The guard had been professional, calm, and unshaken, and that had made all the difference. No matter how much she argued or tried to reason with him, he had stood his ground. He had done his job. And in the end, Karen had to accept it. She glanced back over her shoulder. The guard was still standing there, as stoic and unmoving as ever. His posture hadn't changed. He was still carrying out his duty, just as he had been before the confrontation. The thought made Karen feel even smaller. He hadn't let her behavior affect him. In fact, he hadn't even seemed bothered by her at all. His job was clear, and he was focused on it, no matter what she said. Karen stopped walking for a moment, taking a deep breath. The reality of the situation was sinking in. She had let her frustration and sense of entitlement get the best of her, and it had backfired. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how unreasonable she had been. She had pushed and pushed, expecting the guard to give in, but he had stood firm, and that was something Karen hadn't been prepared for. She had learned something important today. For the first time, Karen understood what it felt like to be on the other side of a situation like this. She had been the one causing the discomfort, the one making a scene. It wasn't something she was proud of. It wasn't how she wanted to be seen. Turning her back on the royal guard, Karen continued walking, but this time, she felt different. There was no more anger or frustration in her steps. Instead, there was a quiet reflection. She knew she had acted out of impatience, not understanding the importance of the traditions she had been facing. She had expected the world to bend to her will, but life didn't work that way. As she walked further, Karen's thoughts shifted. She realized that the people around her weren't there to serve her. They were there doing their jobs, just like she was in her own life. The guard wasn't a character in her world who could be pushed around. He was part of something bigger, something that was much older than her. Karen knew it wasn't too late to change. She could learn from this experience. She could be more respectful in the future, understanding that everyone had their role to play. There was no shame in respecting that, and there was strength in knowing when to back down. As Karen finally left the area, She felt the weight of her actions settle on her shoulders, but this time, it wasn't a heavy feeling. It was a lesson that sometimes humility is the key to understanding, and the royal guard, in his calm professionalism, had shown her exactly what that looked like. Karen spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the palace grounds, her thoughts swirling in her mind. As the cool breeze blew gently across her face, she tried to shake off the frustration that had followed her from her encounter with the royal guard. It wasn't just the embarrassment anymore. It was the nagging feeling that she had learned something important about herself. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so out of control. It was something she wasn't used to. In the past, Karen had always been able to make things go the way she wanted. People listened to her, or at least she thought they did. But today had been different. She hadn't been able to push the guard around, no matter how hard she tried. And deep down, she realized she didn't really want to act like that anymore. The more Karen walked, the more she began to reflect on how unreasonable she had been. She had let her pride take over, convinced that she was entitled to whatever she wanted. But it wasn't just about the picture anymore. It was about how she had treated someone who was simply doing their job, staying calm and focused in the face of her demands. Karen had always considered herself someone who could control a situation with her words, with her attitude. But the royal guard had shown her a new way of looking at things. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't reacted with anger. He had simply stood firm, showing respect for his duty and for the traditions of the palace. That kind of strength had been impressive. Karen had to admit it. She had been wrong, and the guard had been right to stand his ground. As she continued to walk, Karen's pace slowed. She found a quiet spot near the edge of the palace grounds, where the flowers bloomed in bright colors. She sat down on a bench, her mind still processing everything that had happened. The feeling of frustration had softened, replaced by a sense of calm that surprised her. She realized that, in a way, she had learned something valuable. Her usual approach had always been to demand attention, to make sure her voice was heard. But now, Karen was starting to understand the value of quiet strength. She could have handled the situation differently, with more patience and understanding. Instead of arguing, she could have respected the guard's role and simply enjoyed the experience without trying to control it. Karen thought about the crowd that had gathered earlier. She had noticed their eyes on her, some with curiosity, others with judgment. At first, she had felt irritated by it. But now she realized that the crowd had been watching not just her, but the situation as a whole. They had seen someone who had pushed too far and someone who had maintained their composure and respect. In the end, it wasn't her that had stood tall, it was the guard. As the day began to draw to a close, Karen stood up from the bench, a new sense of purpose in her step. She wasn't going to let this experience define her, but she was going to take something valuable from it. There was no need to demand attention or make people bend to her will. There was strength in patience, in respecting others, and in accepting that sometimes things don't go as planned. Karen walked back toward the palace entrance with a quiet smile on her face. She had learned a lesson today, one that would stay with her for a long time. She didn't need to control everything. Sometimes, simply letting go and respecting others was the strongest thing she could do.